tonight. This is an interview at Lyons Hall, Canisius College, Buffalo, New York. It is the 6th of May, 2008, approximately 9 a.m. The interviewers are Mike Russert and Wayne Clark. Could you give me your full name, date of birth, and place of birth, please?
Richard Olson, Richard Kenneth Olson, January the 15th, 1948. I was born here in Buffalo, New York.
Okay. What was your educational background prior to going into service?
Prior to going into the service, I attended grammar school and McKinley Vocational High School, where I took horticulture.
Okay. Did you were you drafted or did you enlist?
I received my draft notice, and I decided I wasn't in favor of the war. I decided if I had to go, I wanted to try to help, and so I joined so I could become a medic.
Okay, so you did enlist.
I did enlist.
Where did you go? When did you enlist?
At the end of 1967, and I went into basic training, I think January the 3rd, 1968, at Fort Dix, New Jersey.
All right. What was your basic training like, and how long were you there?
Well, basic training lasts for 8 weeks. It was the middle of the winter. It was freezing. All day long you'd be on bleachers and outside in the snow. You get 10-minute break every hour, and you'd have to run down the bleacher steps yelling, "Kill, kill, kill." And it was not something I was crazy about doing.
Mm-hmm.
And when you received your lunch, you had your metal mess kit, and it was about 0 degrees in Fort Dix, and the food froze almost as fast as it hit the mess kit.
Mm-hmm. Was this the first time you had been away from home for an extensive time?
The first time I had been away from home, and I was very lonely. And my birthday was about 2 weeks after I went into the service, and I received a telegram. And they gave it to me early in the morning, the message that I had a telegram, but they didn't tell me what it was. And all day long I was worried that somebody was hurt at home or
mm-hmm.
something awful happened, and was to wish me happy birthday.
Did you keep in contact with those at home while you were away at Fort Dix?
For sure, yeah. In fact, I have a good 100-some letters, maybe 200 from the time I was in the service, from friends and relatives and family. And reading them over now, it brings back the voices of many relatives long gone.
Mm-hmm. Now, these are letters from them to you?
Yes.
Do you have your letters? I
do have a few letters that I wrote them,
mm-hmm.
but
mm-hmm.
not a lot.
Okay. Where did you go after Dix?
After Dix, I went to Fort Sam Houston in Texas, and it was where you took medical training. It was a 10-week course, and it was nice and warm down there at Fort Dix, or Fort Sam Houston, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. In fact, we had a weekend pass, and we went to Mexico and saw the Mexican sites.
Okay. How intensive was your medical training?
It was fairly intensive, and after that, I went to Fort Riley, Kansas, where I worked at Irwin Army Hospital for 6 months on an orthopedic and surgical ward of all fellows who were returning from Vietnam. And on Sunday mornings, they would roll us out of bed if we were sleeping in the barracks, and we'd get an ambulance, and we'd head down to the airfield and unload a load of guys coming back from Japan that had been wounded. Mm-hmm. And can I tell a little story?
Sure,
Something
yes.
that happened? And this one particular day, I'm pushing this fella into the admission part of the hospital, and he has a full body cast on, and he's covered up with a sheet. And I pull back the sheet to see his wound, and it's a great big side wound. And on the wound is covered with maggots crawling. So I quick pulled up the sheet and went over to the nurse and said, this fellow has maggots crawling all over him. And she said, "Don't worry. The doctors in Japan put them there to eat the dead flesh." And that's something apparently they still do. Now, these were not maggots out of the garbage can.
Mm-hmm.
These were homegrown
mm-hmm.
maggots to do a job, and just illustrates how much is involved in a war. It's not just people. Everything is involved.
Did you find that this additional medical training that you went through at the hospital, did that better prepare you for what you would encounter in Vietnam?
I'd say it definitely better prepared me, but there's not a whole lot of preparation to seeing somebody blown up when you come down to it, you know. In a hospital, generally you're dealing with people recovering or they don't make it. But out in the field, it's a lot different. They're fresh wounds, and they can be horrific.
Okay, after you left Riley, where did you go?
In November of 1968, I got my notice for Vietnam. And I was going in January. I went home for a month's leave. My buddy was getting out of the Army, and we hitchhiked from Fort Riley to Chicago, where he lived. And we wore our uniforms so we would be more likely to get rides by truck drivers. And all the way I had my portable tape player, and the Beatles' White Album had just come out. And we played that all the way across the country. And it was an enjoyable experience. I caught the plane home and was home for a month. And then I went to Vietnam.
Okay, so January
the 3rd, 1969, I went to Vietnam. Of course, I'm from Buffalo to Vietnam, and the temperature alone was a shocker. First, though, before I went to Vietnam, they sent me to Fort Lewis in Washington, the state of Washington, for like a week's training. And I was a medic, so I had only shot a rifle at basic training. I'd never shot a rifle afterwards, and never shot one before, and didn't really want to shoot any. And I didn't even think I would carry a rifle when I got to Vietnam, because I was a medic and I didn't see that as my job. And we were at Fort Lewis, and we're going through this training in a little make-believe Vietnamese village. And I'm running, and I trip over a wire, which means the whole place would have exploded. But the rifle I had went through my glass at my eye, and it did not do a lot of damage, but it did cut me right below the eye. And so I had a quick one over the medics, and I'm going, my eye, as if, you know, I had lost my eye in battle, and here I wasn't even in Vietnam. But I was okay. It was just a little flesh wound, but bled a lot.
Now, how did you get to Vietnam? You fly over?
We flew over on a commercial jet, and of course, that was the last time I would see American girls for a while. And it was a very long ride. We stopped in Alaska, and then we stopped in Japan, and I was able to send a couple postcards home from those places. And then landed in Vietnam. And
what were your reactions as soon as you got off the plane? The smells?
The smells, and how hot it was, the beauty of the jungle. And
now, where did you land?
You know, I'm not 100% sure, but I believe Tonsonet Air Force Base is probably where we landed. And then we went to Da Nang, where I was there for a day or two. And they originally sent me to Saigon to work in a hospital. So for 2 days, I was in Saigon in a hospital with flush toilets, running water, air conditioning, all the wonderful things of life. And I thought, well, this isn't too bad. The next day, the sergeant came up to me and said, they made a mistake in your orders. And I found myself headed to the 9th Infantry Division in Dong Tam. And that's where I would stay for the remainder of my tour.
Now, whereabouts is Dong Tam?
Dong Tam is in the Mekong Delta down south. And I was only in Dong Tam itself, and it was an army base with about 25,000 guys. I was there for maybe 2 days, and it was the only time I ever filled any sandbags too while I was there. Then I went to an infantry company in the 3rd of the 39th, and I soon found myself out in the jungle doing night patrols for the next 5 months, and we would go out at night and sleep in the jungle.
So you weren't used as a medic, or you?
Oh yeah, I was the medic. I was the medic
Okay.
with the infantry platoon.
Okay. Now, did you carry a weapon?
I did carry a weapon, and the medic who was leaving his name was Levasseur, I forget it, Wayne Levasseur, I think. He gave me his .45. I was a horrible shot, and which was okay. And so I did end up carrying a weapon, and after a while, I came to the conclusion that if you're going to try to protect your fellow soldiers, it doesn't mean just putting a bandage on them now and then. It means being part. So I became a participant. And I can't really think of any other alternative for me.
Did you wear any designation at all that you were a medic?
Oh, yeah, well, eventually I got my combat medic's badge, so that was my designation. I didn't have a cross or anything on my helmet. I don't think we even had that. That wasn't really an option. You didn't want to be identified, because you're out in the jungle with the infantry.
When was the first time you were in combat?
I'm not sure the exact first time, but I can say that every night we would go out at dusk and set up in the jungle. And after maybe 2 weeks or a week and a half, we received some fire. So there was a little combat there, but it was mainly hit and run. And they would shoot at us for a while, and then we'd shoot back, and then they'd disappear. And as time went on, there came to be more and more combat in different sorts of combat. For 5 months, I went out and did night patrols and slept in the jungle, and then we'd come back in the day, and it was fairly safe. We were on this highway number 4, and every mile and a half there was a little post, and there'd be one platoon from our company at each of the 3 posts. Every week we would rotate and go from Duke, Danger, and Diablo were the names of these little outposts. And I have a picture of it, just a mud bunker and another tinier mud bunker, and most of the guys slept under poncho liners outside. The tape I have with the recording was in February, so that's maybe 6 weeks after I got to Vietnam, and there's quite a bit of shooting going on, and there was some gooks out on the rice paddy, and they were shooting at us, and we were shooting at them. And part of our platoon was out for the night, on night patrol. Usually I went out every night, but that particular night I stayed back. There was maybe 5 or 6 of us, was all there was at this little compound.
Now, during the first 5 months, were there any casualties that you had to take care of?
Yeah, there were casualties. One day, two guys, one of the few days when I stayed back, 2 guys, they were in an ambush, the guys that were out there, and 2 guys were wounded. One, his name was David Black, and he lives in California. I found his name on the internet, so we've been corresponding for last year. But he lost his eye there, and the other guy's name was Callahan, and he received a number of flesh wounds. I don't think they were terribly serious. But one of the problems when people got wounded, they'd be medevaced, and you would not know their status afterwards usually, because we weren't near the hospital. So they would be medevaced. If they were bad, they'd be sent to Japan and then to America, and we would never find out what happened. And I spent years trying to find out what happened to one of my best friends who was wounded.
Did you ever find out?
Well, yes and no. His name was William Roberts, and here's what happened. We were out on patrol. This was maybe April or May of 1969, and we're walking on a rice dike, and I was maybe the 3rd or 4th guy in the line, and he was right behind me. And as we're walking, people are pointing out the grenades, the booby traps in the ground. And all of a sudden, my buddy, William Roberts, behind me says, "Doc, we better trade places. You're too far up." So we trade places. And 100 feet down the road, he steps on a grenade. And it gets blown up, just a lot of fragments in his body. So we call in a dust-off. and they take him away. And he was in pretty bad shape.
What do you mean by a dust-off?
A dust-off is a medic evacuation helicopter, which would come and take the wounded, and they'd have some medical equipment and a nurse there or whatever to help stabilize him till they got back to the field hospital. So they took him away, and I know he was in very bad shape, but I didn't know if he lived or died. Then many years later, I went to the Wall in Washington, D.C., and they had people there that would look up names for you. So I asked him if his name was on the wall, William Roberts. There were 4 William Roberts on the wall. So I didn't know if one of them could have been him or not, and I had no idea where he lived in America. I also asked my name. There were 4 Richard Olsons on the wall. So it's just kind of ironic to a point. So another time, I come home and I'm still trying to figure out how can I ever get a hold of him. And there was 3 of us that hung around together. The third guy's name was Steve Foster, and he lives in California too, and we've kept in contact over the years. In fact, in November, I got to see him. My brother lives an hour away from him, and he came and we visited for a few hours. But every time we'd communicate, we'd always ask, did you hear anything about Roberts? That was our big question. So my brother, who sells cars, one day I was telling him about it, and he said, well, did you ever do a credit check? I don't do credit checks, on people. He said, well, let's try doing a credit check. So we found a William Roberts that we think was him. And I forget what state he lived in, but I wrote him a letter, and I don't know, I guess I said something like, you may not want to talk, I have no idea. It's 30 years later, and I never did hear a response from him. So I think it's him, but I just felt I could not try to get in touch with him any further because, maybe he's lost his legs, maybe he doesn't want to talk about it, and who knows. So I've never pursued it. But hopefully, and he had decent credit. So hopefully he's alive and doing as well as possible.
What was daily life like?
Well, daily life, while we were at this little base, would be at dusk we go out on patrol. And during patrol at night, there'd be, we're talking about 14 guys maybe at the most, would be out in the jungle and we'd set up. We very often set up on a grave site, which was like in raised ground, and it was just all stone, and supposedly the Vietnamese buried their ashes there or sprinkled their ashes there, and it was all rice paddies around, and then a jungle, nipah palm and that, so you had very good view of anybody that might be coming. We had a star scope that would pick up the rays, and so we would be able to look and see if there was anybody coming or anyone out there. And you didn't want to set up at the same place too often because eventually people find out your location. But we went there quite a bit, and there were geckos in the trees, and they would be swearing at us all night long. And you'd be on guard for an hour and a half, twice a night. So your sleep was pretty broken. And then in the morning, first, as soon as we woke up, we'd get together and we'd come back to our little base camp where we could do whatever we wanted for the rest of the day, sleep or whatever. And every day, the medical sergeant came out in a Jeep from Dongtam, and he would bring our mail, and he would bring us some food, which was just unbelievably bad. And there was the only hot meal we would have were powdered scrambled eggs and, bacon that somebody had cooked hours before. And otherwise, we ate sea rations, or we ate with the Vietnamese a lot.
I was going to ask you that. Do you have much contact with the local people?
Oh, tremendous amount of contact, because we're out there in the jungle. And so we'd have a lot of contact with people. But during the day there, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute, but during the day, you'd write letters, and you'd have to be on guard even at our little base here, and it's right by the road. And there were no shower facilities or bathroom facilities or anything. We had no electricity, no anything. But there was we had one of these, you'd see them in old movies, like a shower stall with a big 55-gallon drum, and you can fill it with water and take a shower right there by the side of the road as people are going by, and you know, it had a little door and stuff. But we didn't bother using that because you had to haul water from the little river down the road. So we just would go down there with set up a machine gun, and we just bathe in the water with the kids running around, the village kids, or the water buffalo going through there or whatever, and you'd come out and it would be pretty bad, and but at least you felt a little refreshed. And you'd mainly write letters home, and okay, after a while we did get a little tape player, and we'd have a little rock and roll music and stuff, and then we found the Army station that played the music, so we'd have that too.
Did you ever have any like USO bands or anything like that?
They did in Dorrington, but I was out in the jungle, so I never got to see any bands or that. And I came in January, so the Bob Hope thing had gone through in December. But for 5 months, I never even went back to Dorrington. I just was really in the jungle for that time. Then we started a new cycle of missions after that, where it was an 8-day cycle. We would spend 2 days in Dorrington, which was the big Army base, and we would see, they had a swimming pool, and my buddy Steve, his best friend, was the lifeguard at the Dorrington swimming pool, and he had this great bunker, and he had fans, and he had electricity, and he had rock and roll music, and of course we would go there and party when we were in Dorrington. And sometimes they'd show movies on the side of the building. They'd be 2-story flatboard buildings where the barracks were. And I remember this one time, they're showing Dr. Zhivago. In Vietnam, it's probably 120 degrees, and it's snowing on this building. And all of a sudden, Dorrington gets attacked by incoming rounds from the VC. They would constantly be popping rounds into there. So you had to run to the bunker until the shelling stopped. And by the time we came out, they just said, the hell with the movie, you know. It's a great movie, but it just was not right in Vietnam to see that. And I remember other occasions when we were in Dorrington. I remember waking up at night and we were getting shelled, and I just didn't even get out of my bunk. I was so tired, you know. I just didn't care. And after a while, you just kind of, you don't really care. If your number's up, your number's up. They say if you're getting shelled, the shell says, to whom it may concern. If you're getting shot at, it's for you. You know, so that was it in Dorrington. But that was part of the 8-day cycle. We'd do that for 2 days. Then we'd take a helicopter, and I did 65 helicopter missions after that. And they would drop us out in the plain of reeds. I think several times we were probably in Cambodia. There were secret missions, but they wouldn't tell us where we were going, but that's what we decided. And so we'd spend 2 days in the jungle basically doing a sweep. Somebody would be a few miles away, and we were supposed to be sweeping the VC towards them. Sometimes we'd find VC, sometimes we wouldn't. One time we found a very large cache of all sorts of stuff, from helmets to clothing to weapons and that, and certainly there were a lot of people over there for that. Then the next part of the 8-day cycle, we went to Fire Base Morgue, which was an artillery base. And when you're out in the jungle and something's going on, you'd call in artillery, and it would come from this fire base usually, because that was in our region. And all around the fire base, they had great big bunkers. And we'd spend 2 days on, it was a rest period for us, and we got hot food, and they had showers, and so it was pretty decent. And they would have a little music there. I don't remember if we saw maybe a USO band, but we might have. I know they had donut dollies. The girls would pass out coffee and pop or donuts or whatever. Occasionally there would be some girls there.
Now, were these Vietnamese women, or?
I think a few times there were some American women.
Mhm.
Usually they came out of Korea, the bands.
Okay, the bands?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so while we were there, we'd be in these bunkers, and you'd be on guard at night on top of the bunker, and sometimes you get incoming rounds. But on my tape, you can hear the monsoons are coming down by that time. So you can actually hear in the background the sound of the monsoons. And it would be soaking wet in there, and there'd be maybe 8 or 10 of us in the bunker, a couple of guys on top. We'd have our radios, and that's what's going on the second part of my tape here. And we'd just be partying and passing around food and peanut butter and M&Ms and whatever we had. And telling stories, it'd be dark, and just try to, as if the war wasn't enough, we'd be scaring each other.
Now, you said in your unit there was some use of marijuana?
There was a lot of use of marijuana, but in our platoon, we had our code. We never got high out in the field. You could only get high when you were back on a base, and it was relatively safe. So one time, I was the medic, so I had an aid bag and I had morphine in there. One fellow with us during the night stole my morphine and shot himself up with it, and we found him the next morning crawling around. We got him on a dust-off. We didn't want him, and he was a fairly new guy, so we told them we didn't want him back, and he never came back to our platoon. The goal was to stay alive and to look out for each other. Partying was secondary, and that's pretty much it. Then
Were there ever any racial tensions within the unit?
we had, in our platoon, we had one black guy, and can't think of his name now. But anyways, we had one black guy, and there was no racial tension, really. In fact, we had a couple other black guys. These guys, our platoon had the Puerto Rican contingent. So there was maybe 5 or 6 guys in our platoon that were from Puerto Rico. And one guy's name was Castro. His is the only name I can remember now. And he could speak good English and Spanish. The other fellows could not speak English. So that's why they put them all together. But they were great in the jungle, because they came from that sort of area, and they were very, they had good vision, and they could shimmy up the coconut trees, and so, we needed each other, and there was really no racial tension with us. Back on at Dongtam, there was a lot of racial tension going on, because you have thousands of guys, and a lot of drugs, and a lot of hard drugs going on, where we just mainly smoked pot. That was basically it. And we didn't have hard drugs out there. And interesting thing about the pot, you would not buy a little bag of pot. Somebody would take a carton of Cools, open them up, empty all the tobacco out, and fill it with marijuana. And they'd sell us a pack of 20 rolled joints and filters for $1. It was very inexpensive. And there weren't a lot of rolling papers around, so that's how they got around that. And so you could buy a whole carton for $5 of marijuana cigarettes.
Was there much illness within the unit, especially when you were out in the forward camps? Dengue fevers, malaria, illnesses from the water, dysentery?
There was a lot of illness from the water. More foot problems were the big thing with us.
Yeah.
Foot immersion was called, because we were in the water once the monsoons came. At first, when I got to Vietnam, the rice paddies were dried and cracked. Then by April, the monsoons started, and they soon filled up with water. And it was far safer to walk in the rice paddy, because on the dike would be the booby traps. So we would walk in the water a lot. And of course, you'd be walking in the water, the monsoons would be coming down, you'd be soaking wet all day long. And sometimes we'd be out 18 hours and we'd sleep outside. If we could, we'd find a hooch and inside of every hooch was a bunker, usually, and the Vietnamese people would go down in the bunker there, underground. They'd take their pigs or the chickens with them, because that's all they had, you know. And we would kind of take over the house for the night and set up our patrol. But you would be soaking wet, and you'd stop to take a break, and you'd sit down and you'd light up a cigarette and relax. I think you had a few minutes. I used to use a bit of C4 and a can, and I'd make a cup of instant coffee. And I did a lot of writing. I'm a poet, so I was writing a lot of poems in Vietnam. And I might write something, and all of a sudden, you'd realize there's something on your leg. And you'd pull your pant leg up, and there'd be a leech there, or a couple leeches. And sometimes they'd be like this, and sometimes they'd be like that. And they'd just be sucking the blood out of you, as if the war wasn't enough. You had to contend with the leeches.
What about skin diseases like jungle rot? Was there a problem with
But there was. But let me get back to the leech for 1 second. The only way to get rid of the leeches was to use your mosquito repellent. You could squirt them, or burn them with your cigarette. And I didn't like to use my cigarette because afterwards you take a drag and it would be like leech guts. So there wasn't a tremendous amount of jungle rot. There must have been a little, but there wasn't a lot. And one thing we would do, especially at the end, I was in Vietnam for about 9 months. I was pulled out of Vietnam in August, and the reason for that was the unpopularity back home. So Nixon had promised that he'd start pulling out the troops. The 9th Division was the first unit he pulled out, and that was us. So maybe for the last 6 weeks in Vietnam, we tried to do a lot of goodwill missions. And our whole company would go out, and we'd go to a village, and we'd set up a little medic station. And anybody from the village could come, and we would try to patch them up and give them some aspirin or do whatever we could. And we gave the kids candy and that. I mean, Americans are pretty generous,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm sure they are today in Iraq, you know, doing the same thing. That's not to say they don't fight the war, but there's another side to them. And so that was a good thing that we did.
Now, what were a lot of the health issues with the people that you were?
Well, some of them were horrible, you know, but I mean, I had an aid bag with aspirin and some minor things, and cuts and bruises I could patch up. But you just did whatever you could and hoped that somehow an aspirin would at least psychologically help somebody that had a bigger problem. If somebody had a major problem, one night we're out on night patrol, and early in the morning they wake me up, and they're bringing in a woman with a little girl, and the woman had had her foot blown off. She stepped on a booby trap, a Vietnamese woman. So we stopped the bleeding and called a medevac, and they took her, and you know, I'm sure the American doctors did whatever they could for her.
Now, did you have any direct contact with any doctors at all?
Oh, no. I mean, I was in the jungle. They were in the hospital. I had no contact with anybody, really. I mean, we'd be out in the jungle for 2 days on those missions, and a helicopter would bring us our water and food and letters and drop it off. So we didn't have, and the brass, the majors and the colonels and the general, they're all up in the air. They're flying around in a helicopter watching you, telling you to do this, do that. And sometimes we would do it, and sometimes we diplomatically figured how to get out of it. Because, you know, they'd want you to charge a wood line or do something that's disastrous for you, but fine for them, you know. So those are some of the things you have to contend with. And there were times when we were out in the jungle, we were beat. We'd be walking for 18 hours, 16 hours in the monsoons, and we just would set up and say we spotted some VC, and we'd call in some artillery so we could get a break, you know. And sometimes you have to do that. Well, unfortunately, it cost the good taxpayers of America $1,000 or two, but even soldiers deserve a little rest now and then.
Mm-hmm. Did you get any sort of R&R at all?
I never got an R&R. But my two buddies, the one who stepped on the grenade, William Roberts and Steve Foster, were there months before me. And one of the bad things about Vietnam is you'd go as an individual, where during World War II, a whole unit would go, so you had a lot of cohesion, is what I'm thinking. Where in Vietnam you didn't, but we built up quite a bit of cohesion. But everybody came and went at different times. So my two buddies went on R&R, and I have a picture of them, that's why I mentioned it. But I didn't take an R&R for the simple reason, by time I was ready to take one, I knew we'd be leaving for Hawaii in a month or two, so I just figured that would be my R&R, and I wouldn't have to spend any other money.
When did you leave Vietnam?
August of, maybe the middle of August of '69 or early August, I forget. And I went to Hawaii, where I stayed for the next 14 months. And I was a medical records clerk in Schofield Barracks, and it was a great job. And on the weekends, we would go down to the beach and we would party all weekend long. And if we were out on a convoy, Army convoy, doing something, we'd pull over our ambulance to the Dole pineapple fields and grab a couple pineapples and throw them in the ambulance, and away we'd go. I'm sure Dole wouldn't mind.
Yeah.
Are there any other stories you wanted to tell us that?
Well,
before you...
one story I will tell you is one of those nights when we were out on night patrol. And it's funny, I wrote a poem years later. Well, maybe I'll tell you this, speaking of years later. When I came home, I put everything away that I had about the Vietnam War. I never talked about it for 20 years. Or people would be in a room talking about it. I would never say I was a veteran. Not that I was ashamed of it, I just didn't want to talk about it. And I started talking about it when the Gulf War started. Because I just decided, if you don't talk about it, people will never know. So that's what prompted me to start talking about it. But there's this one story, and I think of these guys as the mud men of Vietnam. And we're out on night patrol, and it's early in the morning. We had just woken up, and we hear a loud explosion. So we start running. And we get to this, they called them shit moats, because they didn't have toilets or that. So there'd be this moat in the ground, and there'd be fish, carp, and that swimming around in there, and there'd be sticks across there, and we just went to the John there. But anyways, we heard this loud explosion. When we get to this moat, there's 4 American soldiers blown out of this moat. I don't know if they were alive when they went in there, or if they were not. But they were dead when we got there. Although they were not like blown up in pieces. I mean, their bodies are really intact. But they were covered from mud to mud, and I took my shirt off and tried to clean them up. But the hard thing is, after all these years, you still wonder who they were, what their parents thought. I suppose they never found out how they died, I don't know. But that wasn't the only horrible occurrence, but that was a big one, you know.
Now, when you were discharged, or when you went back to the States, did you wear your uniform? Did you encounter any protesters?
Oh, yeah. And I encountered protesters afterwards, too. When I came back, I went to ECC College, and then I went to UB for a while. And I still wore my jungle boots for some reason. I was attached to them. And I did wear my Army jacket. In fact, I have my one Army jacket at home from Vietnam. I don't wear it. It's falling apart. It's there. But I wore my boots, my jungle boots, for a couple years. I must have had a couple pairs, and they were very comfortable. And you know, people would notice them and say something, and I'd say, yeah, I was in the service, but I didn't really talk about it. But when I went to college, in several classes, people knew I was a veteran, and there were other veterans too. So a lot of the people would have a lot of animosity towards veterans and call you baby killers and that and whatever. And well, you know, that's life.
Did most of the veterans stay together on campus?
Well,
maybe.
I don't know. I hung around with 2 other veterans a lot, so maybe they did. You know, I was working and going to school, so I didn't spend a lot of time in the social aspect of school, unfortunately, because I had to work and everything else. But yeah, I'd say veterans, to a point, certainly hung around together. The black veterans, especially. Well, there was a lot of the black movement was really strong in the early '70s, and they stuck together. And I'm sure the white people did to a point too, but it was the black movement was far more vocal and powerful in its way.
Did you use the GI Bill to go to?
Yeah, I did. In fact, and it was great. I went to ECC, which was on Main Street here, down at Timon or something there for a while. And one of those, a Catholic, it had been a Catholic school. In fact, my one Army buddy had the statue of Christ that had to be from there in his apartment. I don't know how he ended up with it, but whether he walked off with it or not. But it was a great statue. And he's long gone. And my other Army buddy, his name was John Ricciano. He had long black hair, and he looked like a Jesus. And I had long hair at the time, too. But John had contracted some sort of lung disease in Vietnam. And he ended up killing himself a few years later because he had 2 little kids. But he wanted to have control over his life. So memories are good and they're bad and they're difficult. But sometimes you need to talk about them, I guess.
Yeah. Did you join any veterans organizations at all?
No, I never did join any veterans organizations, but I know some people in them, and I'm not at all opposed to joining them. It's just that my life has just been really busy, and I work afternoons. So a lot of things take place in the evening like that, so I really didn't, my schedule didn't allow for it more than anything. What I do is I work in a high school. I'm a janitor in a high school, Williamsville High School. I've been there for 28 years or so. And in English, they do a unit on Vietnam. So I go in there every year, take classes, and read my poetry and tell them about the war and play my tape and show my pictures and stuff. And,
do you ever watch any of the movies at all?
for years, I could not watch them. But when I had this... when I decided to start talking about the war, then I started reading a lot about it, and I started watching some movies, and Full Metal Jacket is a heck of a good movie. And in fact, the guy who co-wrote it wrote my favorite book about Vietnam. His name is Mike O'Hara, H-E-R-R, and he wrote a book called Dispatches, which is just phenomenal. But the book the kids in school read is The Things They Carry, which is a beautiful book.
I like that short story. That's a great short story.
Very poetic book by Tim O'Brien, who's actually been in Buffalo too, although I didn't get to see him that day. But so I've read a lot of the literature, a lot of oral histories, Bloods about the blacks and Chicken Hawk, and a number of the other books. And I've written a lot about the war. And in fact, last year I wrote a play about it, and it takes place in America and in Vietnam. And so that's kind of been my life with the war.
How do you think your time in the service changed or had an effect on your life?
Oh, it had a massive effect. Although at the time I won't say it did. I did not like the Army. I didn't like being in the Army, but I loved the part where you got to meet people and do a lot of the things you do. I didn't like the war part. You know, I came right out of the flower power, the Beatles, love. That was my, you know, summer of love. That's what I was living for, and then I got my draft notice. So what do you do? How do you reconcile that, you know? War and peace. To be at war, to be at peace. To be empty, to be full. We all are empty vessels longing to be filled. And then when we were in Vietnam, a guy cut off the ear of a VC, you know, and it just, our machine gunner, it just ticked me off so much, you know. But I wrote a poem about it years later, you know. And to be at war, it ends. To be at war, to be at peace, to be empty, to be full. We all are empty vessels longing to be filled. Dead men do not need ears. I think they have heard enough about war. It is the living who need to listen. It is the living who need to hear that a poem about war should say peace. And that's what I think, you know, all good war writing says at the end of it. It says peace, you know, because otherwise it's madness, you know. And the part that ticks me off the most is women and children being involved. Bad enough when men want to destroy each other, but, you know, senseless killing. And one time we're on helicopters flying in for a landing, and in the rice field is a water buffalo with dead. And this little guy, maybe 12, 14-year-old, that had been on top of him, and his head is just like blown off, and his brains are in the rice thing, you know, and it's just, it's sad. And here's another little story, too. This is not my original high school ring. I graduated in 1966 from McKinley, but I lost my high school ring in Vietnam. We were coming in to a hot LZ landing zone, and we're getting shot at. And we jump out of the helicopter. It's hovering over the rice field. Jump down and start running through the rice paddy for cover. And I slipped on something. And when I pulled my hand out, my high school ring goes flying off my finger. It's like one of those moments in life you never forget, you know. And, well, I didn't have time to stick around and look for my ring in the muck. So I kept on running. But I lost a lot more than my high school ring, you know. And not everything everybody tells you is true. Politicians don't always give you the real story. And but years later, in fact, 10 years ago, working at North High School, after going in there, telling them the story about my high school ring, the teachers bought me a new high school ring. So, you know, I've been wearing it pretty much ever since, and it's just a nice gesture. McKinley Bulldog.
Could you hold this up and tell us where and when that was taken, please?
November 1970 in Schofield Barracks. It's a picture of me the day I was leaving Hawaii to be discharged from the Army. And it was a happy day, and it was a sad day because I had so many friends there, and I did not relish the thought of leaving them all. But it was time to come home and start a new life.
Okay. Now, what other things, you have some other things to show us,
I have
please?
some other things. I have this picture from, I don't know, if you can get the whole picture in there. It's on rice paper, and it was from a destroyed Vietnamese Buddhist temple. And the temple was a real poor man's temple. This was the only thing in there. And it was just a little hooch, really. And this was on the ground in a little frame with no glass. And I like to think it's a picture of Buddha waiting at heaven for the faithful to arrive with his guards. And there's a little dragon at the bottom of the picture. And you can see where it's all worn away. And, you know, the faithful for Buddha are headed up there. But over at one of the other entrances to heaven sits Jesus Christ, waiting for his faithful to arrive. But nobody comes. The faithful are also busy fighting wars. They don't have time. I folded this up and carried it around in my pocket for a week or two before I finally got back where I could put it away. And it was up in my attic for 20 years, and then when the Gulf War started, I got this down and had it framed in.
Any idea how old that might be?
It could be very old, you know, I really don't know, but I love the way it's frayed at the edges, and it's just rice paper. It's very, very delicate paper. Well, I've had it for almost 40 years, and it was old then. So
Now you have some other photographs? and so
I have
on?
some other stuff here.
Yes.
Let me see. That's some. Well, this is a piece of propaganda that the VC would have for the people about Johnson's administration. And you'd find this stuff laying around. And I have this book of Vietnamese poem, probably about Buddha, that we found on a dead soldier.
Okay.
And I have this actual handwritten poem that a Vietnamese wrote, but on the back is a Chinese symbol. So it was a Chinese person who had the paper. Whether they wrote the poem and gave it to somebody, I'm not sure, but in school one time, a Chinese kid told me that what the Chinese symbol means, but I forgot.
Now you found that on a dead...
On a dead VC.
building?
Well, should I pull this picture out? There's several pictures. Right across from where we lived was this hooch with this fellow there with his water buffalo. And the week before we left Vietnam, the pictures on the bottom, we were quarantined on a big Navy vessel for a week to make sure nobody had any horrible diseases.
Okay.
Okay. This was propaganda that would be on the trees. Say no. I can't.
Say no to terror
Terrorists.
and
Massacre against,
the South Vietnamese people.
And on the back of it, I wrote my mother a letter and sent this home as a letter to my mother. And back in the day. And years later, I'm a writer and I send stories out. And the Story magazine had a great story by a Vietnamese guy who's living in exile in France. And I said, please tell him. So they sent me, he wrote me a letter back in French, and his translator translated it into English. Let's see, what else do I have here? Okay, I won't do much more. This is just a postcard that I sent my brothers of Buddha, and it says, Dear Kevin and Randy, hi, it's hot here. The picture is of Buddha. He's one of my best friends. Be good, Rocky the Kid. My nickname was Rocky in Vietnam, and it was years before Rocky Balboa. Obviously not Rocky Balboa. But I wore a peace symbol. And then somebody thought it looked like a little rocket ship. Is when peace symbols first came out. So they started calling me Rocket J. Then it got shortened to Rocky. But it was all over a little peace symbol that I wore. And I was very interested in Buddhism. And I wanted to go to Vietnam to see Buddhist temples and to see what life was like. I was disillusioned. You know, kids are with you. You start growing up and you see the hypocrisy around you, and it seemed like they weren't talking about stopping the war in church. Things just seemed wrong. And so you focus on other things, other cultures, because you can't see the blemishes that they have. So those are a few of my mementos there.
All right, well, thank you very much for your interview.
Well, you're welcome. And this tape is
Thank you.
for you.